Disclaimer. While this video draws inspiration from current events and the lexicon of international geopolitics, its content is entirely a work of fiction. The nations, institutions, and events depicted herein are merely stage props designed for this narrative. There is no intention to recreate actual occurrences, nor do I presume to speculate on the private motives of real-world figures. Real names may appear, but they are not intended for documentary purposes. They function as archetypes, much like the king or the judge in a fable. These names serve as symbols, and their roles are dictated solely by the requirements of the plot. Any resemblance to reality is purely coincidental, and, in all likelihood, reality is far stranger. Furthermore, the inclusion of volatile themes such as abduction, detention, and warfare is not intended to incite or instruct. On the contrary, this is an exploration of what the world looks like when righteousness reaches a fever pitch. If you are left with a sense of unease after watching, it may not be due to the impact of the story itself, but because our reality is already so profoundly unsettling. I invite you to engage with this work as what it is, a creation of the imagination.
Okay, let's dive right in. We've all seen the movies, right? The geopolitical thrillers, the clandestine ops. But today we're looking at something that, well, it makes those fictional plots sound almost like tactical doctrine. We're digging into sources that talk about seizing a sitting head of state, basically kidnapping them, and not as this huge act of war, but as a calculated, even cost-effective tool of foreign policy.
It's a shocking premise. It should be for anyone who still believes in the idea of state sovereignty. Our sources are suggesting this has become a viable option in what they're calling the ruleless international environment. It's really the ultimate expression of power politics, for when the rules just completely break down.
And that's our mission today. We really need to understand what happened, the specific legal precedent that just shattered the system. And then look at why powerful nations are finding this tactic so advantageous and, honestly, cheaper. And finally, what, if any, measures are being proposed to try and, well, build some new safeguards before the whole thing just collapses?
And we're basically tracking the moment the trap was sprung, how the floor of international law just gave way, and then what the new strategic math looks like in the nature of the resistance that's trying to, delay the inevitable.
Okay, so let's start at the foundation. Because according to one analyst we're looking at, it didn't just crack, it completely shattered. You mentioned state sovereignty. Let's talk about the bedrock. What was the old rule? What do the sources mean by the death of the Westphalian system?
It's the sheer weight of history they're talking about is pretty incredible. The Westphalian system, it goes all the way back to 1648. It's the foundational principle that, gave us the modern nation state.
Okay.
In simple terms, it means one sovereign state doesn't interfere in the internal affairs of another. And this is the crucial part. The leader of that state was seen as this inviolable symbol of sovereignty.
Untouchable.
Exactly. To seize a foreign leader was historically the same as a declaration of war. It would trigger a massive military response.
It was an unspoken but absolutely essential rule of the game.
It was an inviolable sanctuary. But one analyst, and I'm quoting here, says that system effectively died in 2024. The rules that govern how nations treated each other for, centuries? They just stopped applying.
And the sources all seem to point to one specific catalyst, the event that put that first devastating crack in the dam, the Venezuela precedent.
That's it. That's where the abstract idea of law met the very hard reality of unilateral action. When the U.S. put an indictment and then later a multi-million-dollar bounty on sitting Venezuelan leaders like Nicolas Maduro, they cited charges like, drug trafficking. But it wasn't just a tough diplomatic stance.
No, it was something else entirely.
It shattered the principle of sovereign immunity right in front of the whole world.
Wow.
By putting a price on a leader's head, you're essentially declaring them a criminal, and their political office becomes irrelevant.
And that is the huge shift, isn't it? The contrast with the older methods is just so stark. Before, if a major power wanted a leader gone, the methods were deniable.
Right. You'd use assassination, maybe, but you'd disguise it as an accident, or you'd blame it on terrorism or some internal faction. It kept your fingerprints clean.
Plausible deniability.
Exactly. It maintained the fiction that states were still playing by the rules, at least on the surface.
But this new trend is It's much more open. It's almost brazenly humiliating.
Precisely. It's not about hiding it. It's about the expectation of openly capturing a leader and, dragging them to a courtroom somewhere, maybe New York, maybe The Hague. Analysts we read describe this as the ultimate humiliation. It's a deliberate statement.
That diplomatic protection is gone.
Gone. And it signals this terrifying confidence on the part of the abducting power.
I find that so chilling, force masquerading as legality. How do the sources kind of elaborate on that?
Well, the moment that sovereign immunity was shown to be so easily violated, the moment that bounty was placed, a state leader was functionally reclassified. They stopped being the representative head of a sovereign political entity.
And they become what our sources call a high-value target.
Exactly that, a high-value target, or HVT. They're now subject to apprehension, just like a terrorist leader or a drug lord. This reclassification changes everything, because now the abducting power isn't invading a country. No, they're just executing a warrant.
It shifts the entire justification from an act of war to law enforcement.
And that makes the tactic terrifyingly efficient from a strategic point of view.
So once that Westphalian floor cracked, they just walked right across the line. And that takes us from a legal debate to a purely tactical one. And once that legal barrier was gone, well, the floodgates opened for military and strategic analysts to start crunching the numbers. And this is where it gets really disturbing, because the sources highlight this economic rationale. It stops being about morality and starts being about budget spreadsheets.
It becomes a cold, hard cost-benefit analysis. The analysts tracking this, and some sources hint at entities like Mossad or the Pentagon, are viewing kidnapping not as this extreme last resort measure, but as an efficient cost reduction plan.
A cost reduction plan. Let's break that down, because one analogy really stood out to me. The sources say it's cheaper to carry one leader out of his bedroom at midnight than to launch 1,000 missiles. What are the actual costs they're avoiding here?
It's not just money, though the savings are obviously immense. A full-scale invasion or even a major air campaign can cost billions, even trillions of dollars, but maybe more importantly, it costs time. It costs years of troop deployments, it costs high casualty rates, both military and civilian.
And then decades of nation building and political entanglement, which, always leads to blowback at home.
Right, so instead of a 10-year occupation, you get a 12-hour extraction mission. The savings are political and human, not just fiscal.
It sidesteps that whole quagmire.
Absolutely. It replaces these massive, costly campaigns with a single targeted special operation. If it works, a new leader is installed, the target is neutralized, and the cost is comparatively tiny. It turns regime change from this multi-billion-dollar, decade-long project into a short-term, high-leverage mission.
But how cynical is this? Are the sources suggesting that the public charges, drug trafficking, human rights abuses, are just window dressing? Or is there a real desire for justice behind it?
That's the tricky part. The great powers don't just grab a leader, they wrap the action in the mask of justice. They'll cite actual, often verifiable charges. But the cynics and the sources argue that these charges are just legal tools to create justification. They turn the law itself into a weapon.
The weaponization of legalese.
Precisely. It's a sign that the world is, as one source put it, returning to the jungle, where sheer force, not treaties, dictates the rules. The abducting power claims moral and legal high ground while operating completely outside the recognized diplomatic structure.
And once you open that door, the threat becomes global. The sources actually talk about a target list. And this isn't just about small, failed states.
No, not at all. One strategic paper detailed that once the Venezuela precedent was set, any leader of a non-aligned or antagonistic power became a potential HVT. The list they discussed included leaders like Russia's Putin, China's Xi Jinping, North Korea's Kim Jong-un, Iran's Khamenei, but also, leaders of smaller, more rebellious nations that just get in the way of a regional power.
The terrifying implication there is that if this can be justified against any of them, then the threat is no longer localized. It becomes a permanent, global, destabilizing force hanging over every negotiation.
That's the new reality. The threat isn't just that it can be done. It's that the rationale, the cost-saving, force-multiplying logic is just too compelling for a powerful nation to ignore when they're faced with a tough diplomatic problem. Why negotiate for years when a surgical op could theoretically solve it overnight?
So if the Venezuela precedent was the crack in the dam, the lack of a real international response was what blew it wide open. The sources paint this really grim picture of legal paralysis, where the very bodies designed to prevent this kind of chaos just fail.
And that's the crucial question, isn't it? Why didn't the system push back? because international law is only as strong as its enforcement. The sources detail a few specific layers of failure here across the big global institutions.
Let's start with the biggest one, the UN Security Council.
Hopelessly split. An incident like this happens, any resolution to condemn it is immediately hit with a veto from a powerful nation, either the one who did it or one of their allies. This veto power just renders key parts of the UN Charter, like Article 2.4, completely inert.
That's the one prohibiting the use of force against the independence of any state. One source calls it just a piece of paper now. That's a strong statement.
It is, because the text is there, but the will to enforce it is gone. And then you look at the International Criminal Court, the ICC. In theory, it should handle things like this, but it's described as being underfunded and non-functional in this specific context.
And how does that non-functionality play out when a superpower is involved?
Well, the ICC has no police force. It relies completely on member states to make arrests, to gather evidence, to provide funding. When the big powers are the perpetrators, they just refuse to cooperate. They can pull funding, they can undermine investigations. So the silence from the UN and the ICC, as one source put it, it acts as implicit permission for this tactic to become normal.
And that permission immediately set off a chain reaction. The sources detail this, showing how fast this new norm spread.
Yeah, they use these fictionalized but, very illustrative examples. Shortly after the first incident, you see something happen in Central Africa. A pro-China president just vanishes. It's suspected to be a special operation by a former colonial power trying to reassert its influence.
And nobody does anything.
Nothing. No condemnation. And then the rule gets cemented even further. We then see an incident, maybe in Central Asia or Eastern Europe, where a non-recognized state leader gets abducted by a regional rival. And that immediately triggers a military intervention by a major power like Russia, who claims they're acting to protect their interests. Right. So the abduction creates chaos, and then another power uses that chaos as an excuse for more military action.
So it's not even just about regime change anymore. It becomes a tool to actively destabilize entire regions. It's a cascading failure.
The deeper impact is profound. This isn't just about grabbing one person. It's about seizing the world's imagination. It introduces this generalized terror among political elites everywhere. The lack of condemnation made it the new normal. When the world just watches a leader get dragged away and the system does nothing, well, the bar for acceptable aggression gets permanently lowered for everyone.
Okay, so the floor is completely broken. We're in chaos.
Yeah.
But the sources do detail some attempts by scholars and diplomats to fight back. And they seem to recognize that a full, immediate fix for the UN or something, that's just impossible right now.
That's the key. That's the philosophy guiding this resistance. They know they can't put the system back together perfectly. So since fixing the floor is off the table, the immediate focus has to be on delaying the breakdown. It's a strategy the sources call 2, which means buying time. It's damage control.
So the strategy isn't about moral appeals, which clearly aren't working. It's about changing the cold, hard math that made abduction so appealing in the first place. They need to make it unprofitable.
That's the core idea. Change the expectation value of the operation. The resistance has to be based on strategic and economic disadvantage, not just moral outrage. If a country knows that grabbing a leader will trigger immediate, guaranteed, crushing financial sanctions, diplomatic isolation, maybe even specific reciprocal threats, well, then they might hesitate.
And they're trying to formalize that hesitation through diplomatic channels. What are the main proposals on the table?
A big one is the push for a joint declaration. It's an international effort to create a widely accepted statement that says, basically, do not make the capture of state leaders subject to political bargaining. The goal isn't a new treaty. That would take forever. It's about shifting the global atmosphere. Get enough states to sign on, you raise the political cost.
So you create a coalition that guarantees economic pain if the rule is broken.
Exactly. It tries to reintroduce consequences where the veto system failed. Beyond that, there's a more long-term idea, the 21st Century Sovereignty Project.
Tell us about that. It sounds like they're trying to build a whole new legal structure from the ground up.
That's pretty much it. It's a project trying to create transparent legal frameworks designed for this new era. A key idea is a global leader protection monitoring mechanism. It would immediately investigate any suspected abduction and then mobilize the signatory states for punitive action. But crucially, it also tries to create clearer, UN-supervised rules for dealing with genuinely corrupt leaders.
So it provides an alternative path. If there's a legitimate, supervised way to handle criminal leaders, it removes the justification for just going in and grabbing them.
It tries to funnel those legitimate concerns back into a legal framework, so force doesn't automatically win. But what's really fascinating and kind of cynical is that even the powerful nations, the ones who might have started all this, are showing some hesitant interest in these new ideas.
Why? Because they realize the monster they created could come for them next.
It's a shared cross-border fear, the realization that next time it could be you. When the legal structure is gone, nobody is safe. The same cheap surgical HVT tactic could be used by a rival against your own allies, or even against your own leadership. That mutual terror is what's driving the cooperation.
So the one thing that can unite these deeply antagonistic powers is the fear that their own head of state could be the next one dragged out of bed at midnight.
It seems that way. The fight for you isn't being driven by altruism, it's driven by raw defensive self-interest. So we've tracked this whole collapse. From an inviolable sovereign rule to this cold, cost-effective HVT classification, the world is just caught between this outdated legal system and the modern, cheap, terrifyingly effective tactic of targeted abduction. And this battle being waged by diplomats. It's not for a perfect solution. It's for delaying the total collapse, to buy time for something new to emerge.
And that race against time is all about trying to reintroduce consequence into what's become a lawless space. The analyst suggests the real danger isn't when the laws are broken. It's when the world just starts to laugh at them, dismisses them as impossible to enforce. That's when international law is truly dead.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener, to sort of mull over. If the international community has lost its ability to agree on shared morality, on basic ethics, and deterrence is the only thing left, is the only realistic protection for state leaders today just mutual terror? Or can introducing this sophisticated strategic hesitation, just changing the cost-benefit math, can that alone be enough to prevent the final descent into a completely ruleless world?
The new design for chaos has to be met with an even stronger design for order. And the question remains, which design is going to win?
Disclaimer. While this work is inspired by contemporary news and the lexicon of international politics, the content is entirely fictional. The nations, institutions, and events depicted herein serve only as narrative frameworks, mere stage props for the story. There is no intent to replicate real-world occurrences, nor do I presume to speculate on the private motives of any real-world figures. Real-world names may appear, but they are not used for documentary purposes. Instead, they function as archetypes, much like the king or the judge in a classic fable. These names are symbols, and their roles are dictated solely by the requirements of the plot. Any resemblance to actual events is purely coincidental, and in all likelihood, reality itself is far stranger. Furthermore, the inclusion of volatile themes such as abduction, detention, and warfare is not intended to incite or provide instruction. On the contrary, this is an exploration of what the world looks like when righteousness reaches a fever pitch. If you find yourself feeling unsettled after finishing this piece, it may be less a reflection of the story's success and more a testament to the unsettling nature of the reality we already inhabit. Please engage with this work as a creation of the imagination.